All right, so let's talk about cameras and what to look for when you are picking one up. This is going to be a bit of a crash course, specifically focusing on musicians and the conditions we tend to work in, as well as event photography. So if you're, say, a DJ, you're in a band, you're having somebody take photos of your band, and you want to be able to hand them a camera, that's the kind of stuff that we're going to be getting at. So I tend to break these up into three categories. We've got point and click camcorders, and we have DSLR / mirrorless. Now let's get point and click out of the way real quick. Don't buy one. Your phone will likely take better photos than a point and click. The only advantage of a point and click these days is if it happens to have a really good optical zoom, because optical will almost always be better than a digital zoom. That's it. Right, your phone is going to take better photos than almost any point and click camera that is left on the market, which is why they're largely dead. So don't worry about those. Now, camcorders. If you're looking for purely video, they have a place. However, if you need video and photo, I would ignore them. They take horrendous photos more often than not. That also being said, if you're looking at a camcorder that you can't swap out lenses, right? Usually I think they refer to them as a cinema camera when you can take the lens on and off. I've found in my experience a cheap DSLR with a decent lens on it, even a cheap lens, is going to take better video than a lot of the cheaper camcorders out there, right? If you're looking at sub $300 for a camcorder, new or used, finding a $150 or less DSLR and throwing a good lens on it that was like $150 from the used market, you're going to get better quality. That's been my experience. Your mileage may vary, but I would largely push towards DSLR and mirrorless. Now, I keep talking about those like they're the exact same thing. They are different. DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, though, these days are incredibly similar in terms of feature set and in terms of usability, in terms of image quality, all that stuff. You don't really have to worry about that side of it when you're deciding between the two. The big differences between the two, and this is what I would recommend to everybody. Again, I'm a little biased in this. If you're buying new, you may as well go mirrorless, especially if you're going new camera, new lenses, that kind of thing. It used to be mirrorless was a problem because it uses a different mount than the mirrored DSLRs. And then you'd have way more options for lenses. And if you're buying new, that gap is kind of shrunk. There are still more lenses out there for DSLRs than there are for mirrorless on both used and new. But on the new side of things, they've caught up quite a bit. And generally, a lot of companies are really pushing towards mirrorless being the future. So that's what I would go if you're going brand new. If you're going used or are thinking of getting a new camera and buying used lenses, go DSLR. There are so many more lenses out in the wild, and if you're going on a used camera side of things, so many more DSLRs out there on the used market, right? I got this Canon T3 here. I got this for the equivalent of about $50 American. Now, this one isn't going to be mine soon. This is a gift for my girlfriend, so if she watches this video, she can have her birthday gift early. But yeah, $50 American, right? $70 Canadian or so. And it's a DSLR. It takes great photos. Perfect. So let's talk about DSLRs and mirrorless and what to look for in them. When it comes to megapixels, largely ignore it. An 8K TV, I believe, has about 8 megapixels worth of pixels or something along those lines. If you're not zooming in on your photos, then having the extra megapixels isn't going to be a deal breaker, right? Especially if you're looking at, well, this one's got 18 and that one has 21. Who cares? Okay. Now, if you're talking, some of these older ones, I think this one does 12. That's getting a little bit low by today's standards, but there are other things and other factors that I would worry more about the megapixels. So largely ignore that, especially if it's a deciding between one or the other, cameras or whatnot. I wouldn't worry about the megapixels all that much. Full frame versus crop. Now, full frame is almost always going to be better. Okay, it's not really a debate about whether full frame is better or worse than a crop sensor. Full frame almost always is going to be better. However, is it better enough to warrant the price difference? If you're not making money taking photos or video, I wouldn't worry about a full frame. That's my opinion. Your mileage may vary, especially if you got the money, go full frame, why not? But I don't think it is worth the jump unless you're making money at it. Just my opinion. Yeah, that's purely opinion based, but let's carry on, shall we? So we're looking at a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. What should we look for if we're not paying attention to megapixels, which is the big one they always push? Low light performance and or how high the ISO can go. They're not necessarily the same thing, but they tend to correspond a bit. The ISO is essentially how sensitive the image sensor in the camera is. The reason I got my girlfriend this camera is because she has an older Canon that only goes up to about 1200 on the ISO, where this one goes up to 6400. Now, should you ever set it to its max? Probably not. But the higher it can go means that the steps before you hit peak are, there's more of them. Once you get too high in the ISO setting, you start to get a degradation of your image quality. So we don't like going all the way up, but the higher the setting is, the more sensitive it is, and the less light we need to get a proper image. This is a problem in low light conditions, like at a bar, a club, a lot of events at night. It's just always an issue, is trying to get as much light into the camera as we can, because the setting, this isn't a feature to look for, but the setting we tend to have to work around is our shutter speed. How fast the shutter opens and closes. How long we're exposing the sensor to light. If you expose it for too long, you get a blur. If you don't expose it enough, you don't get enough light and you get a really dark image. So having a more sensitive sensor lets you have a quicker shutter speed if you'd like it, right? If you don't need the quicker shutter speed, especially during the day, there's tons of light out, that kind of thing, you can turn the ISO down and keep your, shutter nice and quick. But that can be an issue, and that's why I find having a higher ISO on a camera is a make or break for me. Now, the exact number it goes up to, I'm not going to tell you, ignore anything that doesn't go up to whatever X amount is, because it's not the end-all be-all. Look for photo examples coming from the camera itself. Cameras have some of the most in-depth reviews you will ever see, and they will always have some night photography if the photographer doing the review is worth their salt. If they don't, just ignore the whole review, in my opinion, especially for our purposes, right? If they're a wildlife photographer and they only take photos during the day, their opinion on what makes a camera good or not shouldn't sway you, because they're doing something completely different than what you're going to be doing with it. So yeah, look for low light performance / ISO. Now, the other thing to really keep an eye out for is video features. And this is where features and specifications really start to matter. I would recommend these days 4K 24 frames per second as a minimum of its feature set. You want to be able to record at 24 frames per second for that cinematic look. And these days, 1080p is often good enough, but having that 4K, it future-proofs you a bit, because if everything on YouTube, for instance, moves to 4K, well, do you really want to have to go and get a new camera? You're going to want it eventually, so if you're buying a new camera, I would recommend it. If you're buying used, 1080p, being able to do 24 frames and 30 frames and 60 and that kind of thing in that kind of ballpark is perfectly acceptable. But if you're buying new, I wouldn't bother buying anything that doesn't do 4K. Just my opinion. Now, do keep an eye out. I have on my camera, for instance, this is a Canon SL3. It crops when I set it to 4K. So it zooms in on the image sensor itself. And it is also a cropped sensor. So if I want to use my 50mm lens that I have here, that I really like this lens, I have to have the camera halfway across the room to get this image here. Right now, I'm at an 18mm lens, and it's still quite a few feet away because that's how far it needs to be. So pay attention to little things like that in regards to the video side of things. Just make sure it has what you need, right? Other things like, oh, when you're at 4K, it doesn't have the same autofocus features as it does at 1080p and stuff like that. It's there. Pay attention to it. But for me, it wasn't a deal breaker. Like I said, I went with the Canon SL3. When it comes to video settings, you want to also make sure that your camera has a clean HDMI out. You might not use it, but you want to make sure you have the option. What that does is the HDMI out on here will send a clean signal. So on a lot of the screens, you have all your settings, right? So you can actually see how many minutes you have that you're recording, what the ISO is, that kind of thing. A clean HDMI out will send a signal out that doesn't have that information. And if you're, say, live streaming a concert, you want that, right? Because then I can send this out to a capture card, USB'd into the computer, out to the world. So, setting to pay attention to. Now, you'll notice I keep talking about Canon cameras, right? I've got a T3 here in my hands. I've got an SL3 sitting on the tripod, and my first DSLR was a Canon T2i. Why am I using nothing but Canon? Do I recommend Canon? Well, I do recommend them, but I recommend all of them. Every brand on the market right now that makes a mirrorless camera and a DSLR, at least every brand you've heard of, makes a good camera. They're all good. Yes, go back into the history of them, and there's a few that have, known issues and overheating problems, stuff like that. Like, be careful on the used market because, I know my T2i has an overheating issue. I know that's an issue with some older Sony cameras. If you're on the used market, make sure, hop on review sites and see if people have had some issues in the past. But if you're buying new, they're all good. The reason I use Canon is because at the time I was buying a camera, I worked at a store that sold Canon, so I got it on a good deal, and now I am stuck because I own a bunch of Canon lenses, and my lens collection is worth more than the camera I'm shooting on. So replacing the camera with a different brand means I also have to replace my lens collection, and I don't want to do that. You are going to get stuck with whatever brand you end up with. So make sure you like it, right? If you're on the used market and you can find something for $50, right, then okay, oh no, I have to buy Canon now because I got it for dirt cheap. And then once I outgrow this camera, I don't outgrow the lenses because I get something like an SL3 or something fancy and throw the lenses from this on it. So make sure though, if you're buying used, again, that it's not a semi-retired or retired mount, but generally speaking, that's why people get stuck in one ecosystem, is once you have lenses that are worth more than the camera is, you're not switching brands. It just doesn't happen. Then on top of that, what happens is settings. Now, not specifications, settings. Finding the settings on this camera, for me, super easy because I always use Canon cameras. So even though I've never used the SL3, the SL3's on there, the T3. I've never used this T3 before, but the day that I picked it up and tested it out to make sure everything worked, because I'm buying a camera for $50. I got to make sure it works. I knew what all of the settings meant. I knew what all of the settings do, and I knew where they were in the menus, and I knew where they were physically because they tend to have similar layouts across the board on all their cameras. If you hand this camera to a Nikon user, they might hate it. Not because the camera's bad, but because, oh, that's not where that setting normally is. I'm having a hard time finding this, that, or the other. So if you talk to somebody and they say, I only use X, Y, or Z camera, and that's the only one they would recommend, they might be fanboying a little bit. But if it's the only one they ever use, it's because they're stuck. They only can use that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm stuck on Canon, and I like Canon, right? Like I said, I have my T2i. It sits in my photo booth. I've got this SL3 that I make all my YouTube videos with now. They make good stuff, but there's no problems anymore with going with brand X, Y, or Z. They're all good. So just go with what you can find in your price range and that you like. And also, like I said, check if, Canon has a whole lot more lenses on the used market than some other cameras do. But if you're buying new, make sure, say you're getting a new mirrorless camera, make sure it has the lenses available that you want, right? If they don't make the lens that you want for that camera yet, well, go with a different brand that does have that lens available. Problem solved. Yeah, so that's kind of the main things when it comes to cameras. I'm going to talk briefly about lenses and what to look for in a lens. Now, when it comes to lenses, generally, again, we want that low light performance options. And we're going to break them up into two categories. We've got prime lenses and zoom lenses. Prime lenses, they don't move. They focus, and that's it. So they don't zoom in, they don't zoom out. Zoom lenses, hey, it's in the name, they zoom. So if you need to be able to stand still and zoom in and be able to zoom out, zoom lenses are where it's at. Prime lenses, generally speaking, will take a better photo at their particular focal length than an equivalent zoom at that specific focal length. But you have to walk around, you have to take a step forward, take a step back to try and get your frame where you want it versus twisting. And at an event, zoom is probably the way to go because you can't necessarily, if you're able to hop on stage and walk wherever you want, sweet. But if you have to sit out in the crowd and you're trying to get exactly what you need, yeah, definitely recommend zoom lenses. Pay attention to the f rating on these, the f-stop, because that is your aperture. That is how big the hole is, essentially, in the lens, of how much light it lets through. And wider, or a lower number, is usually better for low light performance, but it's not the end-all, be-all. It's really nice, and generally speaking, higher-end lenses tend to have a bit of a lower f-stop, but not always the case. But a big tip for somebody looking into zoom lenses in particular. This is a 55 to 250 millimeter lens, and it has an f-stop of 4 to 5.6. What that means is that when I'm all the way zoomed out, my minimum aperture is that 4. All the way zoomed in, my minimum aperture is 5.6. If you have a lens like this, the minimum aperture you should be setting at a concert or at a show or whatever you're taking photos or video at is 5.6. The reason being is then if you zoom in, you have the same aperture. So all of your settings in terms of your ISO and your, not frame rate, your shutter speed, you want to have those settings consistent no matter where you're zoomed in. So if you're using a lens that the aperture changes when you zoom in, there's some that don't, they tend to be more expensive. But if you're using a lens that the aperture changes when you zoom in or out, set it to whatever the highest number is, minimum. Because then when you zoom in, it doesn't change the amount of light. Pro tip from a non-pro. But anyway, hopefully you found that handy. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments. If you disagree with anything I said, feel free to comment as well. I'm always happy to hear some feedback. Yeah, that's cameras in a nutshell. Not the shortest video, but it's what I felt like doing. So watch it or don't. Although if you made it this far, that means you did. If you made it this far, like and subscribe and all that stuff. And I will see you in the next video.